Now at this point in section 8, we have added, we have subtracted, we have multiplied complex numbers. Here's the time in example 4a where we learn how to divide complex numbers. So my first example that we are going to use is 4 minus I over 6I. And we're going to simplify this. Okay, here's the key with simplifying when we're dividing. It looks pretty simplified right now, but one of our rules for simplifying is that you cannot have the imaginary number I in the denominator of a fraction. And that's one of our rules, just kind of like, the English language has grammar, it's kind of our math grammar, that we can't have this imaginary number in the denominator. All right, now how are we going to get rid of this imaginary number I? Well, for any situation when we have an imaginary number in the denominator, we can get rid of that imaginary by multiplying by what is called the complex conjugate. Now, we talked about how complex numbers are written in the form a plus bi. The complex conjugate to a plus bi would be a minus bi. So this word conjugate really just means we have the same thing, but the opposite sign in the middle. Now, like I mentioned, we can get rid of any imaginary in the denominator if we multiply by the complex conjugate, which is what we want to do here. I have a 6i in the denominator, which it's kind of like I have 0 plus 6i. The complex conjugate would be 0 minus 6i, and I want to multiply by negative 6i on the top and the bottom of my fraction. After I do that, that gives me negative 6i times 4 minus I, which we'll have to distribute that in a second. And then 6i times negative 6i, well, 6 times 6 is negative 36. I times I is I squared. And again, let's simplify a little bit more. Negative 6i distributed, negative 6i times 4 is negative 24i. Negative 6i times negative I is positive 6i squared. Over negative 36i squared. At this point, there's one last thing we can do to simplify, and that's to remember that I squared equals negative 1. So right here when I see 6i squared is negative 1. This is 6 times negative 1, negative 6. And I'm writing that right ahead of this right ahead of my negative 24i because our complex numbers, traditionally, again, we have the real part that comes first and then our imaginary. So negative 6 minus 24i at the top, negative 36 times negative 1 is positive 36 on the bottom. And there's one last little thing that we can do to simplify, and that is to realize that all three of my numbers here, negative 6, negative 24, and 36, are all divisible by 6. So that gives me negative 1 minus 4i all over 6 as my final answer. All right, let's do one more example here, one more situation in example 4a. Let's do 5 minus 2i over 3 plus 4i. So I'll call that number 1 over here. Here's number 2. Just like in the first part here, I have an imaginary in the denominator. This is a little bit more complicated. So right now, if I just multiplied by negative 4i, I'd have negative 12i minus 16i squared. So I'd get rid of the imaginary in one part, but I'd still have that imaginary times the 3. Look back up here again. We can get rid by multiplying by the complex conjugate. And my complex conjugate in this case is going to be 3 minus 4i. Always looking at what is in the bottom. Times 3 minus 4i on the top. Now at this point we have a lot of multiplying to do. I have to take this 5 minus 2i times the 3 minus 4i. We're going to have to FOIL. So looking at the top here, 5 times 3, we have 15. Outside is minus 20i. Inside's negative 6i. Last is plus 8i squared over, and then FOIL the bottom here. First, 3 times 3 is 9. Outside is minus 12i. Inside is plus 12i. And then 4i times negative 4i is negative 16i squared. And here's the nice part. When we multiply by the complex conjugate, look at what happened to the denominator. Negative 12i, positive 12i cancel out. Negative 16i squared, well again, I squared is negative 1. So negative 16i squared is really plus 16. And then let's deal with what's on the top. It's 15, negative 20i minus 6i, plus 8i squared is minus 8. Just a little more simplifying to go here. 15 minus 8 is 7, minus 26i all over 25.